Welcome, and thank you for joining us on what promises to be a remarkable journey. Over the course of this documentary, we will visit the graves and final resting places of 50 extraordinary people. People whose deaths no one saw coming, no one was prepared for, and in many cases, no one could quite believe. These are not stories of slow decline or long illness. These are the ones that stopped the world in its tracks. The phone calls that made you sit down, the news bulletins that silenced a room, the Monday mornings when your coworker walked in and said, "Did you hear?" We'll travel from coast to coast and across the Atlantic, from the rolling grounds of Arlington National Cemetery to a tiny island on a private estate in the English countryside, from a jazz cemetery in the Bronx to a small churchyard in rural South Carolina. Some of these names you know as well as your own family. Others may surprise you. All of them left too soon, and all of them left behind a world that wasn't ready to let them go. So, come along. The journey is long, but every stop is worth making. Let's begin. Our first stop takes us to Memphis, Tennessee, and a place that needs no introduction: Graceland. Elvis Presley rests in the meditation garden here, alongside members of his family, and every year roughly 700,000 visitors come to pay their respects to the king of rock and roll. Now, Elvis had his health troubles. Everyone knew that by the mid-70s. The weight gain, the jumpsuits that grew more elaborate, as if to distract from the man wearing them, the occasional slurred performance. But when the news broke on August 16, 1977, that he had been found unresponsive on the bathroom floor of this very estate, the reaction was not proportionate to someone whose decline was public knowledge. It was shock. Pure, widespread, disbelieving shock. He was 42 years old. His death was attributed to cardiac arrhythmia, though the role of prescription medications was debated for years afterward. What people forget is how vital he still seemed to his audience. He had just finished a new tour. He was booked for shows that week. His last album had gone gold. The future tense was still being applied to Elvis Presley right up until the moment it couldn't be anymore. Radio stations across the country went to all Elvis formats within hours. President Carter issued a statement calling him a symbol of the vitality, rebelliousness, and good humor of his country. The world had known Elvis was struggling, but nobody thought the end was that close. Originally buried at Forest Hill Cemetery across town, Elvis and his mother Gladys were moved here to Graceland after a disturbing attempted grave robbery just weeks after the funeral. The meditation garden became their permanent resting place, and it remains one of the most visited private graves in the world. From the biggest name in rock and roll, we travel now to a quieter place, Winchester, Virginia, and the Shenandoah Memorial Park, where a woman who changed country music forever lies at rest. Patsy Cline was 30 years old when she died in a plane crash on March 5, 1963, and at the time, she was arguably the biggest female voice in American popular music. Her recording of Crazy, written by a young Willie Nelson, had crossed over from country to pop in a way that almost nobody had managed before. I Fall to Pieces, Walkin' After Midnight, She's Got You. These weren't just country hits. They were everywhere. The crash happened in a wooded area near Camden, Tennessee, during a small private flight returning from a benefit concert in Kansas City. The pilot attempted to fly through bad weather rather than waiting it out. Patsy and fellow country stars Cowboy Copas and Hawkshaw Hawkins were all killed. She had actually survived a near-fatal car accident just 2 years earlier, thrown through the windshield, her face badly cut, her forehead scarred. She came back from that with an even deeper emotional quality in her voice, as if the pain had settled permanently into the instrument. People who heard her sing after the accident said there was something different, a catch, a shadow, a weight that hadn't been there before. It made her recordings immortal. And then, just like that, she was gone. She was 30 years old, and she had been a professional singer for barely a decade. And yet the body of work she left behind, a handful of singles and albums, is enough to place her among the greatest vocalists in American history. Her grave marker carries the words, "Death cannot kill what never dies, love." In the 1980s, her friends Loretta Lynn and Jan Howard helped fund a bell tower at the cemetery in her memory. Visitors still leave pennies on the marker, a tradition that started decades ago and shows no sign of stopping. The cemetery sits in the quiet farmland of the Shenandoah Valley, a long way from the stages of Nashville, and yet Patsy Cline's presence here is so powerful that the place feels less like a graveyard and more like a shrine. Let's leave the Shenandoah Valley and head to Southern California, to Pacific View Memorial Park in Corona del Mar, where we find two very different legends resting in the same cemetery. The first is someone whose death, on January 26, 2020, is seared into the memory of anyone who watched it unfold on a Sunday morning: Kobe Bryant. The helicopter lifted off from John Wayne Airport, just a few miles from this very cemetery, on a foggy January morning, headed to the Mamba Sports Academy in Thousand Oaks. The 5-time NBA champion, 18-time All-Star, and League MVP was 41 years old and traveling with his 13-year-old daughter Gianna, who was a rising basketball player herself, along with 7 others. The aircraft crashed into a hillside in Calabasas during dense fog. All 9 people aboard were killed. The world found out through an early report that many initially refused to believe. Social media lit up with people begging for it to be a false story. It wasn't. Kobe had retired from the Lakers just 4 years earlier after a 20-year career spent entirely with one franchise. He had won an Academy Award for his animated short film Dear Basketball in 2018. He was deep into his second act, coaching his daughter's basketball team, running a media company, mentoring young athletes. His death felt especially cruel because it came at a moment when people were just beginning to appreciate what Kobe Bryant was becoming off the court. In the hours after the crash, murals began appearing on buildings across Los Angeles, and then across the world. The Staples Center, where he had played his entire career, became a sea of flowers and jerseys. His memorial service, held at the arena on February 24th, the date chosen because Gianna wore number 2 and Kobe wore number 24, drew 20,000 attendees and was watched by millions more. His widow, Vanessa, delivered a eulogy that left the arena in tears. Michael Jordan wept openly on stage, then made a joke about becoming the next crying meme, because Kobe would have wanted people to laugh through the pain. He and Gianna were laid to rest here at Pacific View. The exact location is kept private by the family. And while we are here at Pacific View, let's visit another giant who rests in these same grounds, a man whose name is synonymous with the American Western. John Wayne died on June 11, 1979, of stomach cancer at the age of 72. Now, you might ask, how does a 72-year-old man dying of cancer qualify as a death no one was ready for? Because John Wayne didn't seem like a man who could die. He had beaten lung cancer 13 years earlier, in 1964, losing an entire lung and several ribs to surgery, and had come roaring back to win the Academy Award for Best Actor for True Grit in 1969. He was the Duke. He was indestructible, or so the myth went. When he appeared gaunt and frail at the 1979 Academy Award ceremony, just 3 months before his death, presenting the Best Picture Award, the audience gave him a standing ovation that felt less like applause and more like a goodbye nobody wanted to say. He had made more than 170 films over a career spanning 5 decades. He was the cowboy, the Marine, the frontier lawman. He was America in a Stetson. And when that broad-shouldered silhouette finally disappeared for good, it felt less like a celebrity death and more like the closing of the frontier itself. His grave here at Pacific View was unmarked for nearly 20 years at his family's request. It wasn't until 1998 that a bronze marker was finally placed. From the Southern California coast, let's journey east to Lubbock, Texas, a flat, windswept city on the South Plains that gave the world one of the founding fathers of rock and roll. The city of Lubbock Cemetery is where Buddy Holly is buried, in a plot near the front entrance that the cemetery has marked with a directional sign because so many visitors come looking for it. Buddy Holly was 22 years old. That's worth saying again, 22. In that impossibly short life, he had written and recorded That'll Be the Day, Peggy Sue, Every Day, Oh Boy, Rave On, and Not Fade Away. Songs that Paul McCartney has said were the direct inspiration for the Beatles. He had pioneered the standard rock and roll band format of 2 guitars, bass, and drums. He had helped invent a sound that would shape the next half-century of popular music. On February 3rd, 1959, after a show at the Surf Ballroom in Clear Lake, Iowa, Holly chartered a small plane to fly to the next tour stop rather than endure another long ride on a broken-down tour bus. Richie Valens and J.P. "the Big Bopper" Richardson took the other 2 passenger seats. The plane crashed in a snowy field minutes after takeoff. Songwriter Don McLean would later immortalize the date as the day the music died in American Pie. The family name is actually Holly. The E was dropped by a record label typo that stuck. Fans leave guitar picks on his headstone, a tradition that has become something of a pilgrimage ritual for musicians. What's remarkable about Buddy Holly, beyond the music itself, is how much infrastructure he built for rock and roll in such a short time. He was one of the first artists to use a recording studio as a creative tool rather than just a place to capture a live performance. He experimented with overdubbing, double tracking, and orchestral arrangements. The Crickets, his band, established the template that the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and every guitar band since would follow. He even wore glasses on stage, which sounds trivial but was actually revolutionary in an era when performers were expected to look like movie stars. Holly proved that you could be a regular-looking kid from West Texas and still change the world. 22 years old, the mind reels. From Texas, let us cross the country to one of the most famous and most crowded 2 acres in America. Westwood Village Memorial Park in Los Angeles is a tiny cemetery tucked behind office towers and a movie theater on Wilshire Boulevard. You could walk past it and never know it was there. And yet the concentration of famous people buried here is staggering. We'll visit it 4 times on this tour alone, and each time we'll find someone new. We start with the most famous of all, Marilyn Monroe. She rests in a crypt in the Corridor of Memories, and her marker has been kissed so many times that the bronze has developed a permanent discoloration. Marilyn was 36 years old when she was found dead in her Brentwood home on August 5, 1962, from an overdose of barbiturates. The official ruling was probable self-administered overdose, and the debate over whether it was intentional, accidental, or something else entirely has never stopped. What's beyond dispute is that nobody saw it coming that particular weekend. She had been making plans. She had spoken to friends and her publicist that evening. Then she was gone. She had just been fired from and rehired for the film Something's Got to Give. She had sung Happy Birthday, Mr. President to John F. Kennedy at Madison Square Garden just weeks earlier. Marilyn Monroe was still news, still current, still very much in the present tense when she died. The funeral was organized by her ex-husband Joe DiMaggio, who excluded most of Hollywood. He blamed the industry for her destruction and wanted her send-off to be quiet and dignified. Only 31 people were invited. DiMaggio had roses delivered to her crypt every week for 20 years afterward, and he never remarried. His last words reportedly were, "I'll finally get to see Marilyn." The crypt next to hers at Westwood has been sold and resold for extraordinary sums, and the devotion of fans who visit her resting place shows no sign of fading more than 60 years after her death. Staying right here at Westwood, just steps from Marilyn, we find another name that brings a whole generation back to their living rooms, Farrah Fawcett. Now, Farrah's death from cancer in 2009 was not entirely unexpected. She had been fighting it publicly for nearly 3 years and had documented her treatment in a television special. But the timing of her death on June 25, 2009, is what catches people. Because later that same day, Michael Jackson died. The world's attention pivoted instantly, and Farrah's passing was overshadowed in a way that still stings the people who loved her. She was 62. Before the illness, Farrah Fawcett was an icon in the truest sense. That red swimsuit poster from 1976 sold an estimated 12 million copies, making it one of the best-selling posters in history. Charlie's Angels made her a household name, even though she only stayed one season. She proved she was far more than a pinup with her performance in The Burning Bed in 1984 and again in Extremities on Broadway. She earned Emmy nominations for dramatic work that surprised people who had only seen the smile and the hair. What people sometimes forget about Farrah is that she was a serious artist, not just an actress, but a sculptor and painter whose work was exhibited in galleries. She fought her cancer with a ferocity that matched her Texas roots, traveling to Germany for experimental treatments when American options ran out. And on the day she finally lost that fight, the world was looking elsewhere. It's one of the quieter injustices on this tour. While we're standing in this small and remarkable cemetery, let's walk over to visit a man who made America laugh harder than just about anyone who ever lived. Phil Hartman rests here at Westwood, not far from Marilyn and Farrah, and his death remains one of the most shocking in Hollywood history. On May 28, 1998, Hartman was shot and killed in his sleep by his wife, Bryn, who then took her own life. He was 49 years old. Phil Hartman was the connective tissue of American comedy in the late 80s and 90s. He spent 8 seasons on Saturday Night Live and was so essential to the show's functioning that his castmates called him the glue. He was Bill Clinton, Frank Sinatra, Phil Donahue, and a dozen other impressions that defined the era. After leaving SNL, he became the heart of news radio and provided some of the most beloved voice work in the history of The Simpsons, Troy McClure, and Lionel Hutz, characters that were retired permanently after his death because no one could replace him. What made Phil Hartman's loss so particularly devastating was how unnecessary and senseless it was. He was at the peak of his powers, beloved by peers, with decades of great work ahead of him. Before show business, Hartman had been a graphic designer. He co-created the logo for the band Poco and designed album covers for Crosby, Stills, and Nash. He was a man of extraordinary range, both creatively and personally, and the comedy world has never quite gotten over his absence. John Lovitz, his close friend and SNL colleague, once said that Phil was the only person in Hollywood who had no enemies, which made the manner of his death all the more incomprehensible. Let's leave Westwood now and drive a few miles north to Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, one of the most famous cemeteries in the world. The grounds here are vast, covering more than 300 acres, and the list of notable burials reads like a history of American entertainment. Our first stop takes us to a man who could walk into any room in America and make every single person smile: Michael Landon. When Landon was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in April 1991, he went public immediately, appearing on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson to talk about it with characteristic humor and grace. He was gone just 3 months later, on July 1st, at the age of 54. The speed of it stunned the nation. 3 months. From diagnosis to death, 3 months. Michael Landon had been a television constant for 3 decades. First as Little Joe Cartwright on Bonanza, running from 1959 to 1973, then as Charles Ingalls on Little House on the Prairie from 1974 to 1983, and finally as Jonathan Smith on Highway to Heaven from 1984 to 1989. He didn't just star in these shows, he wrote and directed many of their episodes. He was handsome, warm, and projected a decency that millions of families invited into their homes every week. The cancer had already spread by the time it was found. Landon reportedly told his family that the outpouring of support from fans was the greatest gift of his life. What many people didn't know about Landon was that behind the wholesome television image, he was an intensely driven, occasionally difficult man who demanded excellence from everyone around him and got it. He was also genuinely kind to fans, especially children, and his co-stars spoke of him with reverence. When he died, flags in several states were lowered to half-staff, an honor rarely given to actors. Johnny Carson devoted a segment of The Tonight Show to him, visibly emotional. For a generation that grew up with Little Joe and Pa Ingalls, it felt like losing a father figure twice over. Elsewhere on the sprawling grounds of Forest Lawn, Glendale rests a comedic genius whose death, at 23 years old, was one of the cruelest losses in the history of stand-up comedy: Freddie Prinze. If you're of a certain age, you remember Chico and the Man, the NBC sitcom that debuted in 1974 and made Prinze an overnight star. He played Chico Rodriguez, a fast-talking young Chicano mechanic who wins over a grumpy garage owner played by Jack Albertson. The show was a smash hit. Prinze was also a brilliant stand-up comic who had appeared on The Tonight Show multiple times before he was 20. He was the first major Latino comedy star on American television. And then, on January 29, 1977, struggling with depression, a difficult divorce, and the pressures of sudden fame, Freddie Prinze ended his own life with a self-inflicted gunshot wound, 23 years old. The tragedy rippled through Hollywood and the Latino community in particular. Prinze had grown up in New York, the son of a Puerto Rican mother and a Hungarian father, and his stand-up material drew on the experience of growing up between cultures with a sharp, self-deprecating wit that audiences adored. He once joked that he was a Hungarican. Behind the laughter, though, he was in pain. The pressures of instant fame, a crumbling marriage, and a deepening struggle with depression had overwhelmed him. His son, Freddie Prinze Jr., would go on to become a successful actor himself, a bittersweet continuation of a name that carried so much promise and so much loss. From Forest Lawn, Glendale, let's make a long journey to Hendersonville, Tennessee, just north of Nashville, to the Hendersonville Memory Gardens, where Johnny Cash and June Carter Cash lie side by side. Johnny Cash died on September 12, 2003, at the age of 71, from complications of diabetes. That was only 4 months after the death of his beloved wife June, who passed on May 15, 2003, at 63, following heart surgery. June's death was the blow that many who knew Johnny well believed he simply could not survive. They had been married for 35 years. She had pulled him back from addiction, steadied his hand, and been the great love story of his life. When she died, people around him said the light just went out. 4 months is all it took. Johnny was still working right up to the end. His final recordings, made with producer Rick Rubin, included a haunting cover of the Nine Inch Nails song Hurt that became one of the most powerful music videos ever made. The video was released just months before June died, and watching it now, knowing what was coming, is almost unbearable. Cash had beaten back so many demons, pills, alcohol, near-death experiences, years of hard living, that his fans had come to see him as indestructible. He had walked into Folsom Prison and sung for the inmates. He had stood with the poor and the forgotten. He had been a friend to presidents and outlaws alike. Nobody was ready for both of them to go within a single season. June and Johnny rest side by side here in Hendersonville, and the inscription on their shared plot speaks to a love that defined both of their lives. If you visit, you'll likely find flowers left by fans who still make the trip, because some love stories don't end just because both people are gone. From the rolling hills outside Nashville, let's head back to the West Coast and visit a cemetery that has become a landmark in its own right. Hollywood Forever Cemetery, right in the heart of Hollywood on Santa Monica Boulevard. This is a place where the golden age of entertainment is written in marble and bronze. Our visit here begins with a man whose name defined romance and mystery before the talkies were even invented: Rudolph Valentino. The great silent film star died on August 23, 1926, at the age of just 31, from peritonitis following a perforated ulcer and emergency surgery. He had complained of stomach pain for weeks, but refused to cancel public appearances. When he finally collapsed at a party in New York City and was rushed to the hospital, doctors operated and initially expressed optimism. Then infection set in. His condition worsened rapidly, and within days, he was gone. His death triggered mass hysteria on a scale America had never seen. Riots broke out outside the funeral home in New York. An estimated 100,000 people lined the streets for his funeral procession. Nothing like it had happened before, and it wouldn't happen again on that scale until the death of Elvis a half-century later. Valentino had been the first true movie sex symbol. Women swooned at the sight of him as the Sheik, And men were threatened enough by his appeal that newspaper columnists questioned his masculinity, which infuriated him. He had gone from a penniless Italian immigrant working as a busboy and a taxi dancer to the most famous face in the world in the span of just a few years. His death at 31, from something as mundane as a stomach ulcer, seemed grotesquely unfair. Valentino's crypt is here at Hollywood forever, and for decades after his death, a mysterious woman known as the Lady in Black left a single red rose at his resting place each year on the anniversary. The identity of the original Lady in Black remains disputed, but the tradition was carried on by various women over the years, a testament to a charisma that outlasted even death. Let's leave Hollywood now and travel deep into the South, to Montgomery, Alabama, and the Oakwood Annex Cemetery, where the greatest country singer who ever lived is buried. And I'll stand by that claim against all comers. Hank Williams died on January 1st, 1953, in the back seat of his powder blue Cadillac somewhere on the road between Knoxville, Tennessee and Canton, Ohio, where he was headed to play a New Year's Day concert that he would never reach. He was 29 years old. His driver, a college student hired for the trip, didn't realize Hank had died until they stopped, and he couldn't wake him. The official cause of death was heart failure, likely brought on by a combination of alcohol, morphine, and chloral hydrate. But Hank Williams, at 29, had already lived enough for 3 lifetimes. He had written Your Cheatin' Heart, I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry, Hey Good Lookin', Cold, Cold Heart, Jambalaya, and I Saw the Light. He had defined what a country song could be: simple, direct, and so honest it made your chest hurt. His grave here at Oakwood Annex remains one of the most visited in the South, and when Hank Williams died, country music lost its Shakespeare without any warning at all. What's remarkable about Hank is that he could barely read music. He played by ear and wrote lyrics on scraps of paper, on the backs of envelopes, in the margins of magazines. The songs just poured out of him, and they spoke to the loneliness and heartbreak of ordinary people with a directness that no one had achieved before, and few have matched since. He was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame in its inaugural year, 1961, and his influence stretches far beyond country. Bob Dylan, Mick Jagger, and Bruce Springsteen have all cited him as an essential figure in their musical education. To visit his grave in Montgomery is to stand at the crossroads of American music and wonder what might have been. From the world of country music, let's travel north to a place that might seem unexpected on a tour of celebrity graves. Latrobe, Pennsylvania, a small town in the foothills of the Allegheny Mountains. This is where Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers to everyone, is buried at Unity Cemetery. He died on February 27, 2003, of stomach cancer at the age of 74. Now, you might say that 74 isn't terribly young, and stomach cancer is a known killer. So, how does Fred Rogers belong on this tour? Because nobody knew he was sick. Fred Rogers kept his diagnosis almost entirely private. And when he died, the announcement blindsided a nation that had grown up thinking of this gentle man in the cardigan sweater as a permanent fixture of American life. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood had aired from 1968 to 2001, reaching hundreds of millions of children over more than 30 years. He was an ordained Presbyterian minister, a vegetarian, and a lifelong swimmer who maintained his weight at exactly 143 pounds for decades. A number he considered meaningful because I love you has 1 letter, 4 letters, and 3 letters. His death felt like losing a member of the family who had always been there and who you somehow assumed always would be. What people sometimes don't realize about Fred Rogers is how radical he was. He put his feet in a wading pool alongside a black police officer at a time when public swimming pools across the South were being drained rather than integrated. He addressed divorce, death, war, and disability on a children's show, in language that respected kids enough to tell them the truth. He testified before Congress to save public broadcasting, and his testimony was so sincere and so powerful that the committee chairman, who had been hostile moments before, said, "I think it's wonderful. Looks like you just earned the $20 million. Fred Rogers made kindness look easy, but it wasn't. It was a discipline, practiced daily with the rigor of a saint, and the warmth of a neighbor. Latrobe, Pennsylvania still celebrates him, and Unity Cemetery, where he rests alongside his wife Joanne, who passed in 2021, is a place of genuine pilgrimage for people who grew up believing that they were special, just the way they are, because a man in a cardigan told them so. From the gentle world of Mr. Rogers, we must now shift to a death that was anything but gentle, one that has haunted American culture for more than half a century. Let's travel to Culver City, California, and the Holy Cross Cemetery, where Sharon Tate is buried. The young actress was 26 years old and 8.5 months pregnant when she was murdered in her Benedict Canyon home on August 9, 1969, along with 4 others by members of the Manson family. Tate had appeared in Valley of the Dolls and had been praised for her comedic turn in The Fearless Vampire Killers, directed by her husband, Roman Polanski, who was in London at the time of the murders. She was beautiful, talented, and on the verge of major stardom, and her death was so horrifying and so random that it changed the way America thought about safety, celebrity, and the end of the 1960s. Joan Didion wrote that the 60s ended abruptly on August 9, 1969. Tate's mother, Doris, spent years advocating for victims' rights and against parole for her daughter's killers, becoming one of the first prominent advocates for the rights of crime victims in the American legal system. Sharon was buried here at Holy Cross with her unborn son, whom she and Polanski had planned to name Paul Richard. The grave serves as a quiet counterpoint to the sensationalism that has surrounded the Manson case for decades. There are no circus trappings here, just a mother and her child resting in a cemetery where the loudest sound is birdsong. Also here at Holy Cross Cemetery, just across the grounds, rests a man whose death caught the world completely off guard, Bing Crosby. Old Der Bingle died on October 14, 1977, on a golf course in Spain just after finishing a round. He was 74 years old and had just remarked to his playing partners what a great game it had been. Then he collapsed from a massive heart attack. It was the kind of exit Bing himself might have scripted, quick, painless, and on a golf course, which was his second favorite place in the world after a recording studio. Bing Crosby was the best-selling recording artist of the 20th century at the time of his death, with an estimated 800 million records sold. White Christmas alone has sold more than 50 million copies and remains the best-selling single of all time. He won the Academy Award for Best Actor for Going My Way in 1944 and was nominated again for The Country Girl in 1954. He was also a pioneer of recorded entertainment, having championed the use of magnetic tape for pre-recording radio shows, which eventually led to the development of television recording. Nobody expected his death that day in Spain. He'd been performing just days earlier, and seemed in perfectly fine health. Bing Crosby had been a fixture of American life for so long, from the 1930s through the 1970s, that his absence created a silence people could almost hear. He had hosted television specials, made holiday traditions, and provided the soundtrack to an entire era of American optimism. His annual Christmas television special was one of the most watched broadcasts in the country. To lose him on a golf course in Spain, doing the thing he loved second most in the world, was a shock wrapped in a kind of poetic rightness. If Bing had to go, at least he went happy. Let's leave Holy Cross and head north to San Fernando Mission Cemetery in the Mission Hills area of Los Angeles, where a teenager who changed American music rests in peace. Ritchie Valens was just 17 years old when he died in the same plane crash that killed Buddy Holly, whom we visited earlier in Lubbock, on February 3, 1959. 17. He'd had a hit record for barely 6 months. La Bamba, his rock and roll adaptation of a traditional Mexican folk song, and Donna, a ballad he wrote for his high school girlfriend, had both been massive hits. He was the first Mexican-American rock star, a kid from Pacoima in the San Fernando Valley who taught himself guitar and could play anything he heard. Ritchie Valens was afraid of flying, deeply, genuinely afraid, after a mid-air collision between 2 aircraft over his junior high school in 1957 had killed or injured several of his classmates on the playground below. He wasn't supposed to be on that charter plane in Iowa. he won his seat in a coin toss with another musician. That coin toss has haunted rock and roll history ever since. He was buried here, near his childhood home, and fans still visit to pay their respects to a teenager who might have changed the world if he'd had the time. Richie Valens was the son of Mexican-American parents in a neighborhood where most kids didn't dream of rock stardom, and yet he dreamed it and achieved it before he was old enough to vote. La Bamba was especially significant. It brought a Mexican folk song into the mainstream of American popular music, proving that rock and roll could speak in any language. His story was told in the 1987 film La Bamba, starring Lou Diamond Phillips, which introduced him to a new generation. He was 17 years old. He had been famous for about 6 months. And the only reason he was on that plane instead of the tour bus was a coin flip. There are moments in history that hinge on chance so slim that they're almost impossible to accept, and this is one of them. From the San Fernando Valley, our journey takes us across the country to Hartsdale, New York, and Ferncliff Cemetery, a place that holds an astonishing number of famous burials. Among them is a woman whose voice could shatter your heart and piece it back together in the span of a single note, Judy Garland. She died on June 22, 1969, in London, at the age of 47, from an accidental overdose of barbiturates. Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, the girl who sang Over the Rainbow when she was 16 and broke every heart in the theater, gone at 47. Garland's life had been a series of tragedies wrapped in transcendent talent. MGM Studios had put her on diet pills as a teenager, starting a cycle of pharmaceutical dependence that would define the rest of her life. She was fired from films, she made comebacks, she earned an Academy Award nomination for A Star is Born in 1954 that many felt she should have won. She packed Carnegie Hall for a legendary concert in 1961. Through it all, that voice, pure, emotionally devastating, never failed her, even when everything else did. She married 5 times. She attempted to end her own life more than once. She was broke. She was exploited by managers and husbands who saw her as a commodity. And yet, when she stepped onto a stage, all of it fell away. And what remained was something so raw and so true that audiences wept. Her concert at Carnegie Hall in 1961 was recorded live and won the Grammy for Album of the Year, one of only 2 live albums ever to receive that honor. She was originally interred here at Ferncliff, and her crypt became a gathering place for fans. In 2017, her remains were moved to Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles at her family's request so that she could rest near her contemporaries. But Ferncliff is where she lay for nearly 50 years, and it's where many people first came to say goodbye to a woman who had given them everything she had, which was everything. While we are at Ferncliff, there's another giant we must visit, someone from an entirely different world. Malcolm X, the civil rights leader born Malcolm Little, was assassinated on February 21, 1965, while speaking at the Audubon Ballroom in Manhattan. He was 39 years old. 3 gunmen rushed the stage and shot him multiple times. His wife, Betty Shabazz, was in the audience with their 4 daughters. Malcolm X had spent the final year of his life in an extraordinary period of transformation. After his split from the Nation of Islam and his pilgrimage to Mecca, he had returned with a broader, more inclusive vision of racial justice that was beginning to attract a wider audience. His autobiography, dictated to Alex Haley and published shortly after his death, became one of the most important books of the 20th century. He is buried here at Ferncliff, and his grave is visited by admirers from all over the world. What makes his death belong on this tour is not just that he was murdered, the danger he faced was well known, but that the specific timing was a shock. He had told friends he believed he was being targeted, yet the security at the ballroom that day was minimal. It happened in broad daylight, in a room full of people, and nobody could stop it. 3 men were convicted of his murder, though decades later, 2 of those convictions were vacated after a review revealed that prosecutors and law enforcement had withheld evidence. The case remains a wound in American history that is never fully healed. Malcolm X was 39 years old, and he was in the middle of becoming something new, something that might have changed the trajectory of the civil rights movement and the nation itself. His autobiography, published just months after his death, has never gone out of print, and it remains required reading in classrooms across America. Let's leave the East Coast and travel to the heartland, to Park Cemetery in Fairmount, Indiana, where one of the most unforgettable figures of the 1950s is buried. James Dean died on September 30th, 1955, when his Porsche 550 Spyder collided with another car at a highway junction near Cholem, California. He was 24 years old and had completed just 3 films: East of Eden, Rebel Without a Cause, and Giant. Only the first had been released at the time of his death. The other 2 came out posthumously, and audiences watched a dead man become the biggest movie star in America. Dean was headed to a car race in Salinas. He was an avid amateur racer, and was driving his new Porsche at high speed when another driver turned into his path. His mechanic, riding as a passenger, survived. The other driver survived. Dean did not. He was buried here in Park Cemetery in his hometown, and his grave remains one of the most visited in Indiana. The headstone has had to be replaced because fans kept chipping off pieces as souvenirs. Visitors leave all manner of tributes: cigarettes, coins, flowers, small toy cars. James Dean became the template for the doomed young star, an archetype that didn't really exist before him. What makes him endure is not just the tragedy of the death, but the quality of the work. 3 films, 2 of them released after he was already in the ground, and every single one is a masterpiece. He was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actor twice, both times posthumously, a distinction no other actor has matched. He was 24, and the century of celebrity that followed has never stopped trying to replicate the hole he left. From Indiana, let's travel to the Chicago suburb of Hillside, Illinois, to Mount Carmel Cemetery, which holds one of the more unusual entries on our tour. This isn't a beloved entertainer or a cultural icon in the traditional sense. This is Al Capone, Scarface, public enemy number 1, the most notorious gangster in American history. He died on January 25, 1947, at the age of 48, from cardiac arrest following a stroke, at his estate on Palm Island, Florida. What makes Capone's death a surprise to many people is that he was only 48. The notorious gangster who had terrorized Chicago in the 1920s, who was linked to the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, who had been convicted of tax evasion in 1931 and sent to Alcatraz. He was barely past middle age when he died, but his mind and body had been devastated by neurosyphilis that had gone untreated for years. He had been released from prison in 1939, mentally diminished, and spent his final years at his Florida estate in a state of increasing confusion. His family brought him to Chicago for burial. I include Capone not because anyone mourned him the way they mourned Elvis or Buddy Holly, but because his death at 48, his mind gone, his empire dust, is one of the great unexpected final chapters in American history. People expected Al Capone to go out in a blaze of gunfire. Instead, he spent his last days confused and babbling on a lawn chair in Florida. His doctor said he had the mental capacity of a 12-year-old child by the end. The man who had once controlled a criminal empire worth more than $100 million in today's money, who had corrupted police, judges, and politicians, who had lived like a king at the Lexington Hotel in Chicago, died quietly, almost invisibly, while the world had long since moved on. He was buried here at Mount Carmel, alongside his father and brother, and his grave remains one of the more unusual stops for cemetery visitors in the Chicago area. It's a strange feeling standing at the grave of a man you can neither mourn nor celebrate, and yet whose story is so deeply American that it refuses to be forgotten. From the mobster to a place of genuine reverence. We're going to Arlington National Cemetery, just outside Washington, D.C., where more than 400,000 service members and their families rest on over 600 acres of hallowed ground. Our stop here is at a grave that shook a nation more profoundly than perhaps any other in the 20th century, President John F. Kennedy. The eternal flame that marks his burial site has been burning since his funeral on November 25, 1963, 3 days after he was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. He was 46 years old, the youngest elected president in American history, the father of 2 small children, and the leader of a nation that was simultaneously terrified of nuclear annihilation and wildly optimistic about its future. November 22, 1963. Everyone who was alive that day remembers exactly where they were and what they were doing when they heard. Walter Cronkite removed his glasses and choked back tears on live television. Schools sent children home. The world stopped. His wife, Jacqueline, still wearing her blood-stained pink suit, stood beside Lyndon Johnson as he took the oath of office on Air Force One. She refused to change her clothes. "Let them see what they've done," she reportedly said. The funeral procession through Washington, the riderless horse with boots reversed in the stirrups, 3-year-old John Jr. S salute. These images are seared into the American consciousness. More than 800,000 people lined the streets of Washington for the funeral procession, and an estimated 175 million Americans watched on television, the largest audience for any event in the history of the medium at that time. JFK is buried alongside Jacqueline, who died in 1994, and 2 of their children who died in infancy. The eternal flame is visible from across the Potomac, and this remains the single most visited site in the cemetery. Millions of visitors each year walk up the gentle slope to stand before the flame and read the excerpts from Kennedy's inaugural address carved into the surrounding wall. More than 60 years after his death, people still weep there. The debates about what might have been, about Vietnam, about civil rights, about the space program, continue endlessly. But what is beyond debate is the magnitude of the loss the nation felt on that November afternoon. Kennedy's assassination didn't just end a presidency. It ended a certain kind of American innocence, and the country has never fully recovered it. Not far from President Kennedy at Arlington rests his brother. Robert F. Kennedy was shot on June 5, 1968, moments after claiming victory in the California Democratic presidential primary at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. He died the following day. He was 42 years old. Bobby Kennedy's assassination was devastating on its own terms, but what made it almost incomprehensible was the timing. It came just 2 months after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. 2 great voices silenced in 63 days, and a nation already reeling from one murder had to absorb another. Bobby had entered the presidential race as an anti-war candidate and had quickly become the hope of a generation. His speech on the night of King's assassination, delivered extemporaneously from the back of a flatbed truck in Indianapolis, is considered one of the great addresses in American political history. He calmed a crowd that didn't yet know King was dead. Indianapolis was one of the only major American cities that did not experience riots that night. Sirhan Sirhan, angered by Kennedy's support for Israel, shot him in the kitchen pantry of the Ambassador Hotel as Kennedy was being led through a shortcut after his victory speech. Bobby Kennedy's grave at Arlington is marked by a simple white cross, and visitors leave flowers and notes there throughout the year. What those who remember Bobby Kennedy recall most vividly is the sense that he had been growing into something remarkable, that the young man who had served as his brother's sometimes ruthless attorney general had deepened into a figure of genuine moral authority. He quoted Aeschylus from memory on the night King was killed. He walked through impoverished neighborhoods without security. He was becoming the leader the country desperately needed, and then he was gone too. Let's step away from Arlington and from political violence for a moment. We're headed to Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City, California. Yes, we were here earlier for Sharon Tate and Bing Crosby. And now we return for a man who made the whole world laugh, John Candy. The great Canadian comedian died of a heart attack on March 4, 1994, in Durango, Mexico, where he was filming the Western comedy Wagons East. He was 43 years old, the same age, as it happens, as Chadwick Boseman when he died, though their stories could not be more different. Candy was one of those rare performers who was funny simply by existing. His timing, his expressiveness, his willingness to commit completely to a bit. He was a gift. From his early work with the Second City Television Ensemble through films like Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, Uncle Buck, Cool Runnings, and The Great Outdoors, Candy created characters you wanted to spend time with. He was also a deeply kind and generous man by all accounts. His weight had been a concern for years. He carried well over 300 pounds, but he had been trying to get healthier. The night before his death, he had stayed up late working. In the morning, he was found dead. Hollywood was gutted. Chris Farley, another large, funny, kind-hearted man whose death we'll discuss later on this tour, reportedly wept for days. Dan Aykroyd, who had written The Great Outdoors for Candy and remained one of his closest friends, delivered a eulogy that mixed laughter with tears. What people loved about Candy, what made him different from so many other comics, was his warmth. He didn't need to be cruel to be funny. He never punched down. The scene in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles where his character, Del Griffith, sits alone in a burned-out car, and you realize the chatty, annoying salesman is actually profoundly lonely. That's the moment people point to when they talk about what John Candy could do that nobody else could. He could break your heart while you were still laughing. From one gentle giant of comedy to a mother-daughter story that still takes the breath away, let's travel to Forest Lawn Hollywood Hills in Los Angeles, where Carrie Fisher and Debbie Reynolds are entombed together. Carrie Fisher, best known as Princess Leia in the Star Wars saga, died of cardiac arrest on December 27, 2016, at the age of 60, on a flight from London to Los Angeles. She had been on a book tour. The next day, her mother, the legendary actress Debbie Reynolds, star of Singin' in the Rain, died of a stroke at the age of 84. Debbie reportedly told her son Todd, "I want to be with Carrie." And then she was gone. But Carrie Fisher was so much more than Princess Leia. She was a best-selling author whose novel Postcards from the Edge was a sharp, devastatingly funny exploration of addiction and Hollywood dysfunction. She was one of the most sought-after script doctors in the movie business, doing uncredited rewrites on films you'd never guess she touched. She was also brutally honest about her struggles with bipolar disorder and substance abuse, becoming an advocate for mental health long before it was fashionable. She once described herself as an actress who happened to be mentally ill rather than a mentally ill person who happened to act. And that distinction mattered to millions of people who saw themselves in her candor. Some of Carrie's ashes were placed in a giant Prozac-shaped urn, because of course they were. She would have wanted it that way. Debbie Reynolds, for her part, had survived the public humiliation of her husband Eddie Fisher leaving her for Elizabeth Taylor, a scandal that consumed the tabloids of 1959 and would have destroyed a lesser woman. She survived bankruptcy. She survived the loss of her Hollywood memorabilia collection, which she had spent decades assembling. And she remained a working entertainer for more than 6 decades. The idea that she survived everything except the loss of her daughter is almost too poignant to bear. They rest together here at Forest Lawn, and their joint memorial was a celebration of 2 women who lived enormous, complicated, hilarious, and ultimately inseparable lives. Todd Fisher later said that his mother didn't die of a stroke. She died of a broken heart. Whether that's medically accurate doesn't matter much. It's emotionally true, and everyone who heard him say it knew it. From Hollywood Hills, let's drive south to Inglewood, California, to the Inglewood Park Cemetery, where the First Lady of Song rests in peace. If you've never heard of Inglewood Park Cemetery, you're not alone. It doesn't have the name recognition of Forest Lawn or Hollywood Forever, but it holds one of the most important figures in the history of American music. Ella Fitzgerald died on June 15, 1996, at the age of 79, from complications of diabetes that had cost her both legs below the knee. While her death wasn't sudden in the way a plane crash is sudden, it caught many people off guard because Ella Fitzgerald had been such a constant presence for so long, from the 1930s swing era through the early 1990s, that her absence seemed impossible. She won 13 Grammy Awards and sold over 40 million albums. She performed with every major figure in American music, from Duke Ellington to Frank Sinatra. Her songbook series of albums, recording the works of Cole Porter, George Gershwin, Irving Berlin, and others, is considered one of the greatest achievements in recorded music. Ella Fitzgerald's voice was synonymous with joy, precision, and effortless beauty. She could scat sing with an improvisational brilliance that put her on equal footing with the greatest jazz instrumentalists. And she could turn a simple pop standard into something that felt like it had been written for her voice alone. She had started out as a teenager performing at amateur night at the Apollo Theater in Harlem. She had originally planned to dance, but she was too nervous and sang instead. That decision changed the course of American music. Over the next 6 decades, she became the most decorated female jazz artist in history, a living landmark whose name was synonymous with excellence. When that voice went silent for good, a piece of the American soundtrack went with it. She rests here in Inglewood, and the simplicity of her resting place stands in quiet contrast to the enormity of her contribution. Let's travel back to the East Coast now, all the way to Hawthorne, New York, to the Gate of Heaven Cemetery, a large Catholic cemetery in Westchester County where the greatest baseball player most Americans have ever cared about is buried. Babe Ruth, the Sultan of SWAT, the Bambino, died on August 16, 1948 of nasopharyngeal cancer at the age of 53. Ruth had been ill for 2 years by the time he died, but the country's response was extraordinary. More than 77,000 people filed past his casket at Yankee Stadium over 2 days. The outpouring of grief was massive, even by the standards of a man who had been the most famous athlete in the world for a quarter century. Ruth had retired from baseball in 1935, and by 1948 he was gaunt and frail, barely able to stand when he made his final appearance at Yankee Stadium for the retirement of his number. The photograph of Ruth from that day, leaning on a bat, his camel hair coat hanging loosely on his diminished frame, is one of the most iconic images in sports history. He passed away just 2 months later. Ruth had changed baseball, and American sports, in ways that are hard to overstate. Before Babe Ruth, the home run was a rarity. He turned it into the centerpiece of the game. In 1920, his first year with the Yankees, he hit 54 home runs. The next closest player in the American League hit 19. He built Yankee Stadium, the house that Ruth built, through sheer box office appeal. He was also an orphan, essentially, sent to a reformatory school at the age of 7, where he learned to play baseball and found the only family he ever really had. His grave here at Gate of Heaven in Westchester County, alongside his second wife Claire, is easy to find. Even now, more than 75 years after his death, fans leave baseballs, bats, and handwritten notes at the site. The Bambino still draws a crowd. From the world of baseball, let's shift gears entirely and head south to Belton, South Carolina, to the Welfare Baptist Church Cemetery, where a man whose secrets stunned the world is buried. Chadwick Boseman, the star of Black Panther, died on August 28, 2020, at the age of 43 from colon cancer that he had been diagnosed with 4 years earlier, and that almost no one outside his immediate family knew about. Boseman had filmed numerous major films while privately undergoing chemotherapy and surgery, including Black Panther, Avengers: Infinity War, Avengers: Endgame, and Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. He told almost nobody. When his death was announced, the shock was absolute. Fans, colleagues, and even close collaborators had no idea he was ill. The announcement on his social media accounts became the most liked post in the history of Twitter at the time. He had played Jackie Robinson in 42, James Brown in Get On Up, and Thurgood Marshall in Marshall before becoming T'Challa, the King of Wakanda, in a role that meant everything to millions of people around the world. To have played those heroes while fighting cancer in secret is an act of courage that rivals anything on any screen. He was laid to rest here, near his hometown of Anderson, in a small church cemetery far from the red carpets of Hollywood. The contrast is striking and deliberate. A global superstar buried in the kind of modest southern churchyard where his grandparents might have worshipped. What Boseman understood And what his death made painfully clear was the difference between celebrity and character. He had both, but only one of them mattered to him. In the months after his death, stories emerged of his quiet visits to children's hospitals, of the hours he spent with young cancer patients while fighting the disease himself. He never mentioned it publicly. He just showed up, put on a brave face, and gave those kids whatever strength he had left. There are not many people on this tour, or anywhere else, about whom you can say something like that. From South Carolina, let us travel across the South to Hurtsboro, Alabama, to the Mount Hope Cemetery, where one of the most shocking deaths in modern sports history is memorialized. Steve McNair, the former NFL quarterback for the Tennessee Titans, was shot and killed on July 4, 2009, at the age of 36 by his girlfriend, who then took her own life. McNair was found dead in a Nashville condominium. He had led the Titans to Super Bowl XXIV in 2000, where they lost to the St. Louis Rams on the famous one-yard short play, a moment that remains one of the most dramatic in NFL history. He was co-MVP of the NFL in 2003. His death was a total shock. A beloved athlete, a father of 4, killed in an act of violence that nobody saw coming. The Titans organization and the city of Nashville mourned him deeply. McNair was one of the toughest quarterbacks ever to play the game, a man who played through injuries that would have sidelined most players. And the idea that his life ended not on a football field but in such a senseless act of violence is almost impossible to reconcile. He had grown up in Mount Olive, Mississippi, one of 14 children, and had attended Alcorn State University, a historically black college where he set NCAA records that still stand. He was a third-round draft pick who outplayed his expectations at every turn. In retirement, he had been active in his community and was seen as a role model. His death at 36 stripped away the notion that toughness on the field translates to safety off of it. From the gridiron to the racetrack, let's travel to Mooresville, North Carolina, a small lakeside town about 30 miles north of Charlotte, to Iredell Memorial Park, where Dale Earnhardt, the Intimidator, is buried. If you're not a racing fan, it can be hard to understand the magnitude of what Earnhardt meant to NASCAR and to the millions of people who followed the sport. Imagine the most beloved figure in any sport you care about, and then imagine losing that person on live television, on the biggest day of the season, on the very last lap. That's what happened on February 18, 2001. The 7-time NASCAR Cup Series champion died in a last-lap crash during the Daytona 500. He was 49 years old. The crash appeared relatively minor compared to the violent wrecks NASCAR fans were accustomed to seeing, but the angle and forces involved caused a fatal skull fracture. What made Earnhardt's death so devastating was the context. His son, Dale Earnhardt Jr., and his teammate Michael Waltrip were running first and second as they crossed the finish line. Earnhardt had been blocking other cars to protect their positions. He was killed doing what made him a legend, racing fearlessly. Earnhardt was the most popular driver in NASCAR history, a blue-collar hero from Kannapolis, North Carolina, who drove the famous black number 3 car and embodied everything his fans valued: toughness, directness, and an absolute refusal to back down. His death led to sweeping safety improvements in NASCAR, including the mandatory use of the Hans device, a head and neck restraint system that has almost certainly saved lives in the years since. In that sense, Earnhardt's death, like so many on this tour, was not entirely without meaning. He is buried in a private section of the cemetery, but fans know the area and visit regularly. The number 3 has been retired in his honor, and the black car that carried it remains the most recognizable vehicle in the history of American motorsport. For millions of fans across the South and beyond, Dale Earnhardt wasn't just a driver. He was their driver, and losing him on the biggest stage in the sport, on the last lap of its biggest race, is a wound that has never fully closed. Let's slow down from the roar of the racetrack and return to music. We're heading back to Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York, the same grounds where we visited Judy Garland and Malcolm X, to pay our respects to one of the architects of modern jazz, Thelonious Monk. The great pianist died on February 17, 1982, at the age of 64, from a stroke. He had withdrawn from public life in the mid-1970s, living quietly and rarely speaking or playing. The silence of his final years was itself baffling. This was a man who had changed the language of jazz, whose compositions like Round Midnight, Straight, No Chaser, and Blue Monk were standards played by every jazz musician alive. When he died, it was the quiet end to a long, mysterious withdrawal. But for the audience who remembered him on stage, angular, eccentric, getting up from the piano to dance while the band played, his absence left a hole that has never been filled. Monk's music sounded wrong to people who didn't understand it, and that was precisely the point. He played notes that shouldn't have worked together and made them swing. He left silences where other pianists would have filled the space, and those silences were as musical as the notes. He was a true original. There was no one before him who sounded like that, and no one after who could replicate it. He rests here at Ferncliff alongside many other musical giants, and if there is any justice in the arrangement of eternity, he is still playing, still dancing, still wearing one of those extraordinary hats. Speaking of music cut short by aviation, let's travel south to Jacksonville, Florida, to the Jacksonville Memory Gardens, where the lead singer of one of the biggest bands in America is buried. On October 20th, 1977, just 2 months after the deaths of Elvis and Bing Crosby, making it one of the cruelest years in entertainment history, a plane carrying the members of Lynyrd Skynyrd crashed into a heavily wooded swamp near Gillsburg, Mississippi. Lead singer Ronnie Van Zant, guitarist Steve Gaines, and backup singer Cassie Gaines were among those killed. Van Zant was 29 years old. The band had just released their album Street Survivors, and the original cover featured the band surrounded by flames, an image so eerie in retrospect that it was immediately changed after the crash. Freebird and Sweet Home Alabama had made Lynyrd Skynyrd one of the biggest bands in America, and Van Zant's raw, passionate vocals were the heart of the sound. The crash happened because the plane, a Convair CV-240 that the band had been warned was in poor mechanical condition, ran out of fuel. Van Zant was originally buried at the Orange Park Cemetery in Jacksonville, but his remains were later moved to Jacksonville Memory Gardens after a disturbing grave disturbance. The story of Lynyrd Skynyrd and that doomed flight remains one of rock and roll's most harrowing chapters. Several band members survived the crash with severe injuries. Drummer Artemis Pyle crawled from the wreckage and stumbled through the swamp to find help. Guitarist Gary Rossington, the last surviving original member, carried the band's legacy for decades afterward until his own death in 2023. Freebird, with its soaring guitar solo that builds and builds until it seems to lift off the ground entirely, has become the unofficial anthem of Southern rock. And every time it's played live, there's a moment near the end where the crowd goes quiet, as if remembering what it cost. From Southern rock, let's travel to Southern California one last time and visit a death that confounded the entertainment world in ways that no other death on this tour quite matches. At Forest Lawn Hollywood Hills, Andy Kaufman is buried, assuming, of course, that you believe he's actually dead. The comedian, if that word even applies to what Andy Kaufman did, died on May 16, 1984, at the age of 35, from kidney failure caused by a rare form of lung cancer called large cell carcinoma. Kaufman had never smoked a single cigarette in his life. He practiced transcendental meditation and was health conscious. The cancer seemed to come from nowhere, and his death was made more surreal by the fact that Kaufman had spent his entire career blurring the line between performance and reality. He had publicly declared that if he ever faked his own death, he would come back 20 years later. So when he died, a significant number of people simply didn't believe it. His comedy partner Bob Zmuda fueled the speculation for years. But Kaufman is gone. He was Latka Gravas on Taxi. He was the self-proclaimed intergender wrestling champion of the world. He was a man who read The Great Gatsby aloud to audiences who had come expecting comedy. He wrestled women on television and was genuinely despised by millions who didn't realize they were watching performance art. His feud with professional wrestler Jerry Lawler was so convincing that audiences were divided for years on whether it was real. It wasn't, but the commitment to the bit was total. His death at 35, from a cancer that no one could have predicted, was the final, cruelest twist in a career built on the unexpected. Jim Carrey later portrayed him in the 1999 film Man on the Moon, and Carrey's immersion in the role was so complete that the line between actor and subject became as blurred as anything Kaufman himself ever attempted. 20 years came and went after Kaufman's death, and he didn't come back. He's here at Forest Lawn, and the joke, if it ever was one, is finally, definitively over. Let's cross the Atlantic now and visit a death that shook not just a nation, but the entire world. We're going to the Althorpe Estate in Northamptonshire, England, where Diana, Princess of Wales, is buried on a small island in the center of an ornamental lake called the Round Oval. Diana died on August 31, 1997, at the age of 36, from injuries sustained in a car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris. Her driver, Henri Paul, was later found to have been intoxicated and lost control of the Mercedes at high speed while being pursued by paparazzi. Diana's companion, Dodi Fayed, and Paul were killed as well. Bodyguard Trevor Rees-Jones survived. Diana's death triggered an outpouring of grief unlike anything Britain had ever experienced. Millions of flowers were piled outside Kensington Palace and Buckingham Palace. Elton John performed a rewritten version of Candle in the Wind at her funeral at Westminster Abbey, watched by an estimated 2.5 billion people worldwide, the most watched live broadcast in television history. The single, released as a charity record, became the best-selling single since records began, surpassing even Bing Crosby's White Christmas. Her brother, Earl Charles Spencer, chose to bury her at the family's ancestral home rather than in the Spencer family crypt at a nearby church, citing a desire for privacy and security. A path lined with 36 oak trees, one for each year of her life, leads toward the lake. The grave itself is on the island, not accessible to the public, but visitors to Althorpe can view it from a distance and visit a memorial on the grounds. Diana was, at the time of her death, the most famous woman in the world, and her loss, so sudden, so violent, so seemingly avoidable, remains one of the defining moments of the 20th century. She had transformed the British monarchy simply by being human in public, by hugging children with AIDS when others wouldn't touch them, by walking through active minefields in Angola to draw attention to the landmine crisis, by speaking openly about her struggles with bulimia and her unhappy marriage. She made the stiff upper lip seem like a relic. In America, where the fascination with British royalty has always been intense, her death hit with a force that surprised even those who felt it. People who had never met her wept openly. The mountain of flowers outside Kensington Palace grew so large that the scent of them could be detected blocks away. She was 36 years old, the same age, by an eerie coincidence, as Marilyn Monroe. From the English countryside, let's return to the United States and to the world of technology. We're going to Alta Mesa Memorial Park in Palo Alto, California, in the heart of Silicon Valley, where the man who put a computer in your pocket is buried. Steve Jobs, the co-founder of Apple, died on October 5, 2011, at the age of 56 from a pancreatic neuroendocrine tumor. Jobs had been diagnosed in 2003 and had undergone surgery in 2004 and a liver transplant in 2009. He had initially explored alternative treatments before turning to conventional medicine, a decision he later acknowledged as a mistake. He stepped down as CEO of Apple just 6 weeks before his death, handing the reins to Tim Cook in a succession plan that was itself a masterwork of corporate strategy. While his illness was known, his passing still stopped the world. People left flowers, apples with a bite taken out of them, and handwritten notes at Apple stores around the globe. Jobs had created the Macintosh, the iPod, the iPhone, and the iPad. He had been fired from the company he founded, built another empire at Pixar, and returned to Apple to engineer the greatest corporate turnaround in history. His Stanford commencement address from 2005, in which he told graduates to stay hungry and stay foolish, took on a new weight after he was gone. In that speech, he had talked openly about his cancer diagnosis, about confronting mortality, and about the importance of living each day as if it were your last. Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life, he said. 6 years later, those words became an epitaph. He was buried in an unmarked grave at Alta Mesa, a quiet, unassuming cemetery that most people drive past without a second glance. There is no monument, no plaque, no marker for the man who redesigned the modern world. It's hard to imagine a more fitting tribute from a man who believed in simplicity above all else. From Silicon Valley, let's travel to Corpus Christi, Texas, and the Seaside Memorial Park, where a voice that was just beginning to cross over to the English-speaking world was silenced far too soon. If you grew up in Texas, or anywhere in the Southwest, or anywhere that Tejano music is played and loved, then you already know this name. And you already know exactly where you were when you heard the news. Selena Quintanilla Perez, known simply as Selena, the Queen of Tejano music, was shot and killed on March 31, 1995, at the age of 23, by the president of her fan club, Yolanda Saldivar, at a Days Inn motel in Corpus Christi. The killing stemmed from financial discrepancies that Selena had confronted Saldivar about. The confrontation turned deadly in a motel room, and Selena was shot in the back as she tried to flee. She made it to the lobby, where she collapsed. She was rushed to the hospital but could not be saved. Selena was the best-selling Latin artist of the decade, a performer of extraordinary charisma who could command a stage with a confidence and joy that belied her youth. Bidi Bidi Bom Bom, Como la Flor, Dreaming of You. These were songs that transcended language. Her death sent shockwaves through the Latino community and far beyond. Governor George W. Bush declared April 16th Selena Day in Texas. Tens of thousands of mourners attended her services. Her grave here at Seaside Memorial Park is one of the most visited in the state, decorated year-round with flowers, candles, and messages from fans who speak to her as if she can still hear them. Her story became a 1997 film starring Jennifer Lopez, which launched Lopez's acting career. Selena's murder, by a trusted associate over money, was the definition of a death no one saw coming. She had been working on her first English-language album at the time of her death, and Dreaming of You, released posthumously, debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200, making her the first predominantly Spanish-language artist to achieve that distinction. She was 23 years old and on the verge of becoming one of the biggest pop stars in the world. The crossover she was building would have changed the landscape of American music. Instead, it became one of the great what-ifs. From the Texas coast, let's head north to New Jersey, to the George Washington Memorial Park in Paramus, where a man who redefined what television could be rests quietly. James Gandolfini, the star of The Sopranos, died on June 19, 2013, at the age of 51, from a heart attack while on vacation in Rome with his 13-year-old son, Michael. Gandolfini had been enjoying dinner at a restaurant near the hotel, reportedly eating fried prawns and foie gras and drinking 2 piña coladas. He returned to his room and was found by Michael on the bathroom floor. The world lost Tony Soprano, and more importantly, it lost one of the finest actors of his generation, a man who had turned a New Jersey mob boss into the most complex, compelling, and morally ambiguous character in the history of serialized television. Gandolfini brought a depth of emotion, vulnerability, and menace to Tony Soprano that redefined the possibilities of the medium. The show ran from 1999 to 2007 and is regularly cited as the greatest television drama ever produced. Gandolfini won 3 Emmy Awards for the role. Off-screen, he was famously generous, shy, and uncomfortable with the spotlight. He once gave every member of The Sopranos cast a check for $33,000 from his own pocket during a contract dispute, just to help them get through a period without pay. He was not Tony Soprano. He was, by all accounts, a gentle, introspective man who happened to be able to channel darkness and rage with terrifying authenticity. His death at 51, from something as common and as cruel as a heart attack, reminded everyone that the people who seem larger than life are every bit as fragile as the rest of us. His funeral in New York drew hundreds of mourners from the entertainment industry, and the tributes that poured in spoke not of the character he played, but of the man he was. Let's travel from New Jersey to Louisville, Kentucky, to Cave Hill Cemetery, where one of the most charismatic human beings who ever lived is buried. Cave Hill is a gorgeous Victorian-era cemetery that sits on 300 rolling acres beside the campus of the University of Louisville, and among its notable residents is a man who transcended his sport, his era, and his country. Muhammad Ali, born Cassius Marcellus. Clay Jr., Ali died on June 3, 2016, at the age of 74, from septic shock caused by a respiratory infection. Ali had been living with Parkinson's disease for more than 3 decades, and his long decline had been painfully public. Yet the world's reaction to his death was one of genuine shock, because Muhammad Ali had become such a transcendent figure, not just in sports but in culture, politics, and human rights, that his actual passing felt like something that simply could not happen. He was the greatest. He told you so himself, and he was right. 3-time heavyweight champion of the world, Olympic gold medalist at 18 in Rome, conscientious objector who refused to serve in Vietnam and was stripped of his title, a man who sacrificed the prime years of his career for his principles and then came back and won the championship again. His funeral procession through Louisville drew hundreds of thousands of people lining the streets. He rests here at Cave Hill under a simple marker because even Muhammad Ali is equal to everyone else in the ground. What's worth remembering about Ali's funeral is that it was exactly what he wanted. He had planned it himself, years in advance, and he wanted it to be a celebration of unity. The pallbearers included Will Smith, Lennox Lewis, and Mike Tyson. A memorial service was held at a public arena in Louisville, open to anyone with a ticket, and the speakers included representatives of multiple faiths. The funeral procession wound through the streets of his hometown, past the house where he grew up, past the gym where he first learned to box, past crowds of people who threw flowers onto the hearse and chanted his name. It was the goodbye of a king, given to a man who had started life as Cassius Clay from Louisville, Kentucky, and ended it as the most recognized human being on the planet. From Louisville, let's travel to a very different kind of final resting place. We're going to Paisley Park in Chanhassen, Minnesota, a suburb of Minneapolis that most people had never heard of until a man who stood 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighed about 112 pounds made it the center of the musical universe. Paisley Park is the legendary studio, home, and now memorial complex where Prince Rogers Nelson's cremated remains are kept. Prince died on April 21, 2016, at the age of 57 from an accidental overdose of fentanyl. He was found unresponsive in an elevator at Paisley Park. The news was so sudden and so jarring that for a time, people simply refused to accept it. Prince had performed a concert just days earlier and had seemed fine, electric even. The truth, which emerged over the following months, was that he had been managing chronic pain from decades of performing in high heels and doing the kinds of acrobatic stage moves that would break a lesser body, and that pain management had led to opioid use that spiraled beyond his control. Prince was a singular figure in American music. 7 Grammy Awards, an Academy Award for the film Purple Rain, more than 100 million records sold worldwide, and a musical range that encompassed funk, rock, R&B, pop, and jazz, often in the same song. Purple Rain, When Doves Cry, Kiss, Little Red Corvette, 1,999 Inches. Any one of those would be a career-defining hit. He had dozens more, and that's before you count the songs he wrote for other artists. Nothing Compares to You for Sinead O'Connor, Manic Monday for the Bangles, I Feel for You for Chaka Khan. He was a multi-instrumentalist who played nearly every instrument on his early albums, a control artist of extraordinary vision who fought the music industry for ownership of his work and won. Paisley Park is now open to visitors as a museum and memorial, and his presence still fills every room. The elevator where he was found has been sealed off, but the rest of the complex, the studios, the sound stages, the vault that holds thousands of unreleased recordings, is a testament to a creative output so vast that it will take decades to fully catalog. The world is still discovering Prince, even now, and probably will be for a long time to come. From the purple glow of Minnesota, let's travel to the warmth of the Florida coast, to Our Lady of Mercy Catholic Cemetery in Miami, where a man who helped invent the modern television sitcom is buried. Desi Arnaz died on December 2, 1986, at the age of 69, from lung cancer. His death may not have been the same kind of bolt from the blue as an assassination or a plane crash, but the cultural weight of what he represented makes his passing worth pausing over. Desi Arnaz, along with his then-wife Lucille Ball, created I Love Lucy, which debuted in 1951 and changed everything. It was the first show filmed before a live studio audience. It was the first to use the 3-camera setup that remains the industry standard today. It was the first to be shot on 35mm film rather than broadcast live, which meant it could be rerun, a concept that didn't exist before Desi thought of it. Every sitcom you've ever watched owes a debt to a Cuban immigrant who figured out how to make television permanent. Desi was the business genius behind Desilu Productions, the studio that later produced Star Trek and Mission Impossible. His father had been the mayor of Santiago de Cuba before the Revolution of 1933 forced the family to flee. Desi arrived in Miami as a teenager who spoke almost no English, and within 2 decades he was running one of the most powerful studios in Hollywood. What many people don't know is that Lucille Ball called Desi on the phone just hours before he died. They had been divorced for more than 25 years, but some bonds don't break. She reportedly couldn't stop crying after the call. He rests here at Our Lady of Mercy, far from the spotlight he helped create. But the light he switched on, the glow of a television screen in every American living room, playing a show that people still watch and love 70 years later, has never gone out. Let's head north now, all the way to Martha's Vineyard, that storied island off the coast of Massachusetts where presidents vacation and old money summers. Abel's Hill Cemetery sits on a wooded hilltop in the town of Chilmark, and here, in this quiet New England burial ground, one of the most explosive comedic talents of the 20th century is buried. John Belushi died on March 5, 1982, at the Chateau Marmont Hotel on the Sunset Strip in Los Angeles from a combined injection of cocaine and heroin, what's known as a speedball, administered by a woman named Kathy Smith, who later pleaded no contest to involuntary manslaughter. Belushi was 33 years old. He was one of the original not-ready-for-prime-time players on Saturday Night Live, and had become the biggest comedy star in America with the 1-2 punch of National Lampoon's Animal House in 1978 and the Blues Brothers in 1980. He was electric, anarchic, physically gifted, and wildly self-destructive. His drug use was an open secret in Hollywood, but his death still sent a shockwave through the industry because of the sheer waste of it. He was so talented, so young, so full of ideas that it seemed impossible the world would have to go on without him. Dan Aykroyd, his partner in the Blues Brothers, later said that Belushi had enough ideas for 10 careers. He wanted to make serious films, he wanted to do music, he wanted to try everything. The waste of it, the sheer, stupid, preventable waste, was what hurt the most. He was buried here on Martha's Vineyard, where he had a home and where he had found a measure of peace away from the chaos of Hollywood. The grave was later moved to a more secluded area of the cemetery because fans were leaving tributes that disturbed the surrounding plots. A boulder marks the spot now, and visitors who know where to look still come to pay their respects to a man who burned so brightly that 33 years simply wasn't enough fuel. Since we're thinking about comedy and loss, let's travel to the heartland, to Madison, Wisconsin, and the Resurrection Cemetery, where another large, funny, kind-hearted man rests in the chapel mausoleum. Chris Farley, the Saturday Night Live star and movie comedian, died on December 18, 1997, at the age of 33, from an overdose of cocaine and morphine in his apartment in the John Hancock Center in Chicago. He was found on the floor by his brother John. The parallels to John Belushi, whom we just visited on Martha's Vineyard, were immediate and haunting, and they were not lost on anyone in the comedy world. Both were large, physical, wildly funny performers. Both died of speedball-related overdoses. Both were 33 years old. Farley was reportedly obsessed with Belushi and terrified of following the same path. And yet he did. His SNL characters, Matt Foley, the motivational speaker who lived in a van down by the river, the Chippendale dancer opposite Patrick Swayze, the Gap Girls, are among the most quoted and replayed sketches in the show's history. His films Tommy Boy and Black Sheep, made with his close friend David Spade, were box office hits. He had been cast as the voice of Shrek in the DreamWorks animated film and had recorded much of the dialogue before his death, after which the role went to Mike Myers and the character was reimagined. Everyone who knew Chris Farley says the same thing. He was the funniest person in any room, and also the most generous and the most troubled. Adam Sandler, who was one of his closest friends, later wrote a song about him and performed it on Saturday Night Live that left the audience in tears. David Spade, his partner in Tommy Boy, was so devastated by the death that he couldn't bring himself to attend the funeral, a decision he has spoken about with regret. Farley was laid to rest here in his hometown of Madison, a city that still claims him proudly. The mausoleum where he rests is a quiet, sacred space, and visitors who make the trip are asked to be respectful and brief. The parallel to Belushi is uncanny and terrible. Two men who made millions laugh, both taken by the same poison, both at the same age, as if comedy itself had a dark tax that had to be paid. Let's leave the comedy world for a moment and travel to a grave that takes us into a very different corner of American life. We're headed to Houston, Texas, to Glenwood Cemetery, a magnificent 88-acre property of rolling hills and ancient oak trees, situated improbably close to the glass towers of downtown Houston. Here, among the city's founding families and oil barons, one of the most extraordinary and tragic figures of the 20th century is buried: Howard Hughes. The reclusive billionaire, aviator, filmmaker, and industrialist died on April 5, 1976, at the age of 70. Aboard a plane flying from Acapulco, Mexico to Houston, seeking medical treatment. He weighed barely 90 pounds. He had not been seen in public in years. The cause of death was kidney failure. The man who had once been the most dashing figure in Hollywood, dating Katharine Hepburn and Ava Gardner, directing the controversial film The Outlaw, setting aviation speed records, building the enormous flying boat known as the Spruce Goose, and buying TWA, had become a recluse who lived in darkened hotel rooms, terrified of germs, his body wasted, his mind deteriorating. The FBI had to use fingerprints to confirm his identity. His death was a shock not because anyone thought he was healthy, but because few people even knew for certain whether he was still alive. The discovery of his physical condition, malnourished, dehydrated, with broken-off hypodermic needles lodged in his arms, was deeply disturbing. Here was a man who had once been worth billions, who had dined with presidents and movie stars, who had piloted experimental aircraft at record-breaking speeds, reduced to a skeletal figure dying on a medical flight over the Gulf of Mexico. He was buried quietly here in the family plot at Glenwood, alongside his parents, and his estate became the subject of one of the most complicated legal battles in American history. Hughes left no valid will, or rather, multiple wills surfaced, none of which could be authenticated. The fortune was eventually divided among his relatives after years of litigation. His story is a cautionary tale of almost mythic proportions, the American dream turned inside out, the pursuit of perfection that ends in complete disintegration. From Houston, let's travel to the Bronx, New York, to Woodlawn Cemetery, one of the most magnificent burial grounds in America. More than 300,000 people are buried on these 400 rolling, tree-lined acres, and the list of notable interments reads like a who's who of American arts and industry. Among the many giants resting here is the man who changed the sound of the 20th century more times than anyone else in jazz, Miles Davis. He died on September 28, 1991, at the age of 65, from the combined effects of a stroke, pneumonia, and respiratory failure. By 1991, his health had been declining. But what earns Miles a place on this tour is the sheer enormity of what the world lost. He reinvented jazz at least 5 times over a 40-year career. Cool jazz in the 50s, modal jazz with Kind of Blue in 1959, electric jazz fusion with Bitches Brew in 1970, and his late experiments with hip-hop and electronic textures in the 80s. Kind of Blue remains the best-selling jazz album in history. Even in his final years, Miles Davis carried an authority and mystique that made him seem like he would go on forever. He played with his back to the audience. He wore sunglasses on stage in the dark. He spoke in a raspy whisper that made everything he said sound like a secret. He was difficult, brilliant, demanding, and utterly without compromise. He was buried here at Woodlawn, and the cemetery's grounds hold a remarkable concentration of jazz royalty. Duke Ellington is buried here as well, making this hallowed ground for anyone who loves American music. If you stand between their graves, you're standing at the crossroads of an art form that this country gave to the world, and there is no more sacred ground in jazz than this. Let's leave the Bronx and head to Glendale, California, to Forest Lawn Memorial Park one final time. We've been here before for Michael Landon and Freddie Prinze, but now we're here to visit the man who created the Muppets, Jim Henson. The beloved puppeteer, director, and dreamer died on May 16, 1990, at the age of 53, from toxic shock syndrome caused by a streptococcal bacterial infection that led to organ failure. The speed of his decline was terrifying. Henson had felt unwell for a few days, but delayed seeking treatment, reportedly not wanting to be a bother. By the time he reached the hospital, it was too late. Doctors said that if he had come in even hours earlier, he almost certainly would have survived. Jim Henson was the creator of Kermit the Frog, Miss Piggy, Fozzie Bear, Gonzo, and the entire Muppet universe. He had also created beloved Sesame Street characters, directed The Dark Crystal and Labyrinth, and was in the middle of negotiations to sell his company to the Walt Disney Company when he died. At his memorial service, held at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York, the thousands of attendees were asked to bring something colorful, and no one was permitted to wear black. Performers sang Muppet songs while butterflies were released inside the cathedral. It was the kind of farewell Jim Henson would have loved. Joyful, creative, and utterly unique. Big Bird, performed by Carol Spinney, sang "It's Not Easy Being Green" on stage, and it was one of the most devastating moments in the history of public mourning. Henson was cremated, and his ashes were placed here at Forest Lawn. The idea that Jim Henson died from something as mundane as an untreated bacterial infection, at 53 with so much left to give, remains one of the most painful losses in entertainment history. He was a man who had dedicated his life to making children laugh, to teaching them kindness and curiosity and the pleasure of being silly, and the world he left behind has been trying to carry on his work ever since. It has done a decent job, but it's not the same, and everyone who grew up with the Muppets knows it. From the world of Jim Henson, let's travel to Westfield, New Jersey, to the Fairview Cemetery, where the greatest voice of her generation, and many would argue of any generation, is at rest. Whitney Houston died on February 11, 2012, at the age of 48, in a bathtub at the Beverly Hilton Hotel in Los Angeles, on the eve of the Grammy Awards. The cause of death was accidental drowning, with cocaine use and heart disease listed as contributing factors. The timing was staggering, the music industry's biggest night, and the woman who had once dominated it was dead in the same building where the celebrations were about to begin. Whitney Houston had sold more than 200 million records worldwide. I Will Always Love You, her soaring rendition of the Dolly Parton song, is one of the best-selling singles by a woman in music history. Her performance of The Star-Spangled Banner at the 1991 Super Bowl, recorded during the Gulf War with fighter jets streaking overhead, remains the definitive rendition of the national anthem. In her prime, there was simply no one who could touch her. 6 consecutive #1 singles, a record at the time, and a voice that combined power, control, and raw emotion in a way that left other singers staring in disbelief. She made it look effortless. It wasn't. Her decline through the 2000s, after years of substance abuse and a tumultuous marriage to Bobby Brown, had been painfully public. But the morning she was found, the music world went silent. Clive Davis, her longtime mentor, and the man who had discovered her, went ahead with his pre-Grammy party that evening in the same hotel, a few floors below where she had died, a decision that was controversial, but that some felt Whitney herself would have understood. The party had always been her favorite night of the year. She was buried here at Fairview Cemetery alongside her father, John Russell Houston Jr., in the working-class New Jersey town where she had grown up singing in the choir at New Hope Baptist Church. Before the fame, before the heartbreak, before the tabloid covers, Whitney Houston was a girl from Newark with a voice that could reach God. Her grave is visited by fans from around the world who still can't quite believe that voice is gone. Her daughter, Bobby Christina Brown, would die tragically just 3 years later, at the age of 22, under hauntingly similar circumstances, found face down in a bathtub. The parallels were almost too cruel to be real. 2 generations of extraordinary talent, 2 women failed by the people around them, 2 lives ended in water. Whitney Houston deserved better. They both did. From New Jersey, let's travel to Dallas, Texas, to the Sparkman Hillcrest Memorial Park, where a man who embodied the golden age of baseball, its glory and its heartbreak in equal measure, rests in peace. Mickey Mantle, the Mick, died on August 13, 1995, at the age of 63, from liver cancer. He had received a liver transplant just 2 months earlier, but cancer was found in the new organ almost immediately. Mantle had been one of the greatest players in the history of the game, a Triple Crown winner, a 3-time American League MVP, a 7-time World Series champion with the New York Yankees. His speed, his devastating power from both sides of the plate, his blonde good looks, he was the American sports hero of the 1950s and 1960s made flesh. But he was also an alcoholic who had been drinking heavily since his teenage years, partly out of a conviction, based on the early deaths of his father and uncles from Hodgkin's disease, that he too would die young. "If I'd known I was going to live this long, I'd have taken better care of myself," he once said with that famous wry grin. In his final public appearances, Mantle was remarkably candid about his failures. He held a press conference after his transplant and told the nation, "Don't be like me." He wanted young people to learn from his mistakes. His death, when it came, felt like the end of an era. More than 2,000 people attended his funeral, and the eulogies celebrated a man who, for all his flaws, had been the boyhood hero of an entire generation. Bob Costas, who delivered the eulogy, spoke of the complicated love fans had for Mantle, how they adored the talent, forgave the weakness, and ultimately recognized in the Mick a mirror of their own imperfect humanity. He rests here at Sparkman Hillcrest alongside some of the biggest names in Dallas history. But for the baseball fans who make the pilgrimage, there is only one grave that matters. Let's head back to the West Coast one final time, to Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles, where we visited Rudolph Valentino and where Judy Garland's remains were eventually moved. Here we'll pay our last Hollywood respects to a man who was once the biggest movie star on the planet, Burt Reynolds. He died on September 6, 2018, at the age of 82, from cardiac arrest. Reynolds had been the #1 box office draw in America for 5 consecutive years in the late 1970s and early 1980s, an unprecedented run. Smokey and the Bandit, The Longest Yard, Deliverance, Boogie Nights, his range was greater than people ever gave him credit for. He was a genuine tough guy who had played football at Florida State before a knee injury redirected him to acting. He was also the first male centerfold in Cosmopolitan magazine in 1972, a photo spread that was considered scandalous at the time and that he said he regretted for the rest of his life. Not because of the nudity, but because he felt it made people take him less seriously as an actor. His death at 82 wasn't the kind of sudden shock that defines most of this tour. But the outpouring of love and remembrance was enormous because Burt Reynolds was one of those figures who seemed like he would always be around, cracking jokes and flashing that famous mustache. He had also been remarkably open in his later years about his regrets, the marriages that didn't work, the money he lost, The serious roles he turned down because he didn't think audiences wanted to see him that way. His performance in Boogie Nights in 1997 earned him an Academy Award nomination and proved that the serious actor had been hiding inside the good old boy all along. He was laid to rest at Hollywood Forever, a cemetery we've visited several times on this tour, and one where the golden age of Hollywood lives on in marble and bronze. In the end, Burt Reynolds came home to the town that made him, and Hollywood claimed him for its own. For our penultimate visit, let's travel to one of the most evocative spots on this entire tour. We're going to Westwood Village Memorial Park one final time. And if you've been counting, this is our 4th visit to this tiny cemetery, which tells you something about how many legends are packed into its 2 modest acres. We're here to visit Natalie Wood. She drowned on November 29, 1981, off the coast of Catalina Island, California, during what should have been a pleasant weekend aboard a yacht. She was 43 years old. The circumstances of her death have been debated, investigated, and reinvestigated for more than 4 decades, and the case has never been fully resolved. What is known is that she was on the yacht Splendor with her husband Robert Wagner and actor Christopher Walken, who had been her co-star in the film Brainstorm, which they were in the middle of shooting. She was found floating in the water the next morning, wearing a nightgown and a down jacket. She had a well-known fear of dark water, a phobia that had haunted her since childhood. The official cause was initially ruled accidental drowning, but the case was reopened in 2011, and in 2018 Wagner was named a person of interest, though no charges have ever been filed. Natalie Wood was a star from childhood. Miracle on 34th Street at age 8, Rebel Without a Cause at 16 alongside James Dean, whom we visited earlier in Fairmount, Indiana. She went on to Splendor in the Grass, West Side Story, and Gypsy, earning 3 Academy Award nominations along the way. She had the rare ability to project both vulnerability and strength on screen, and her performances held up across decades, from child roles to adult dramas to musicals. Her death at 43, under circumstances that have never been fully explained, remains one of Hollywood's most enduring mysteries. The investigation has been reopened, new witnesses have come forward, and the case continues to generate headlines decades later. She rests here at Westwood, not far from Marilyn Monroe, in a cemetery that holds more unanswered questions per square foot than just about anywhere in America. If the stones here could talk, the stories they'd tell would fill volumes, and many of those stories would end the same way, too soon, too sudden, and without a satisfying explanation. And now we come to our final stop. I've saved this one for a reason, because the man we're about to visit touched more lives, more imaginations, and more childhoods than perhaps anyone else on this tour. We are at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, where we've already visited Michael Landon, Freddie Prinze, and Jim Henson. And our last visit is to the man who, more than any other single individual, shaped the entertainment landscape of the 20th century. Walt Disney. The man who created Mickey Mouse, who built Disneyland from nothing but orange groves and imagination, who transformed animated filmmaking from novelty to art form, died on December 15, 1966, at the age of 65, from lung cancer. He had been a heavy smoker for most of his adult life, but the diagnosis came just weeks before his death, and the speed of his decline shocked everyone around him. 1 month he was at work on the plans for what would become Walt Disney World in Florida and his ambitious vision for Epcot, the experimental prototype community of tomorrow. And the next, he was gone. There is a persistent urban legend that Walt Disney was cryogenically frozen, but this is not true. He was cremated, and his ashes were interred here at Forest Lawn. What makes Walt Disney's death belong on this tour is that overwhelming sense of unfinished business, the feeling that the dreamer was taken before the dream was complete. He never saw Walt Disney World open in 1971. He never saw Epcot built. He never got to see how completely his vision would reshape the American landscape, from theme parks to animated storytelling to the very idea of family entertainment. His brother Roy, who had managed the business side of the empire for decades, made it his personal mission to finish Walt Disney World and insisted it be called Walt Disney World, rather than simply Disney World, so that the world would know whose dream it had been. Roy Disney died just 3 months after the park opened, as if his own job was finally done. The empire Walt created has generated more joy, more wonder, and more shared cultural experience than any other entertainment enterprise in history. He was 65 years old, and the world simply was not ready to lose him. And that brings our tour to a close. 50 lives, 50 stories, 50 graves, some grand, some humble, some hidden from public view, some visited by millions of people every year. We've walked through the meditation garden at Graceland and stood before the eternal flame at Arlington. We've visited tiny church cemeteries in South Carolina and sprawling memorial parks in Southern California. We've met musicians and athletes, comedians and presidents, movie stars and dreamers. What connects them all is that moment, the bulletin, the phone call, the headline that made the world stop and say, "Not yet, not them, not now." These people left us too soon, but they left us something too: songs and films and laughter and courage, and the stubborn proof that a single life, no matter how short, can change the world. Thank you for walking with us. Remember them well, and safe travels home.